Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5 Common Blind Spots in Facility Management and How to Fix Them, presented by RealComm. Before we begin our presentation today, I'd like to go over a few meeting logistics. This webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. Please note that this webinar is being conducted via audio broadcast, so the sound will be delivered through your PC speakers, so please make sure you have those turned up. Should you encounter any technical difficulties, please contact either WebEx directly at the number listed on your screen, or you can send an email to Daniel Devine at ddevine@realcomm.com. All participant microphones will be muted during the webinar, so please use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of the WebEx screen to ask any questions at any time during the webinar. Questions will be answered by the panelists after the presentation portion of the webinar is completed. And because we may not have time to address all questions at the end, I'm going to try to combine the questions so that the panelists can respond to a theme of the questions that are being asked in an effort to get everyone's questions addressed as best we can. So that takes care of the logistics of the meeting. So let me take a minute here to introduce myself and the panelists. My name is Bob Bushy. I'm with NOI Strategies, a division of CohnReznick, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. I've been a director with NOI Strategies for about 1.5 years. Prior to joining NOI, I've spent the last 25 years creating and maintaining infrastructure solutions in and around the real estate vertical. NOI is a wholly owned subsidiary of CohnReznick, the 11th largest accounting firm in the U.S., and we're comprised of approximately 2,700 employees across 30 cities, with a recognized annual revenue of approximately $575 million a year. NOI Strategies is part of CohnReznick's advisory arm services, and our main focus is in the real estate community. NOI was established in 2003 and acquired by CohnReznick in 2015, and we have operations established in ASPAC, Canada, and the U.S. In 2015, NOI delivered over 103 projects to 56 clients in 10 different countries. Whether it's commercial, residential, or development and construction, we help owners, operators, and investors maximize the value of their assets by providing specialized operational and technology advisory expertise in asset lifecycle management. Our solutions provide deep insights into financial and operating data that drive superior decisions that result in minimizing OPEX, structuring CAPEX to maximize value, and streamlining the asset acquisition and disposition process. But enough about NOI. I'd like to take a minute to introduce the 2 gentlemen that will be leading today's webinar. Jeff Thompson is the co-founder and executive director at Aware Manager. He's been at the helm for some time and has completed some of the most complex and high-profile facility management projects, working with clients that include the World Trade Center in New York and more than 130 Heinz properties. Jeff works directly with leaders within these organizations to make internal processes more efficient, improve overall transparency, and lower operating costs. Tommy Gunn currently serves as Senior Director of Special Projects and Initiatives for Philips High-Tech, where he leads large projects aimed at improving overall portfolio efficiency and positioning the company's real estate assets for the changing healthcare industry. Prior to this position, Tommy was acting global head of real estate markets for Philips, responsible for 904 buildings and 550 employees across approximately 55 million square feet of space. I'd now like to turn the mic over to Jeff to lead us through the webinar. Jeff?
Thanks, Bob. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to move through the slides relatively quickly to get right on to Tommy's presentation on blind spots and resolving them. But just on the way there, what I'd like to do is talk about, I'd like to put those into context a bit, because there's some underlying ideas to sort of lead or support, the resolution to some blind spots that people run into. So we're going to talk a little bit about transparency, then go through blind spots, and then talk about monitoring versus sort of the traditional infrequent reporting that people tend to rely on and maybe over-rely on, and then sort of getting started and then move into sort of a Q&A type of session for this. So where we want to start is the idea of creating the right data model. So one of the things that's changed about the industry over the last few years is they used to have very insulated solutions where you have a solution for a department within a company, You might have several different solutions for several different departments, and then for the companies that work with them, again, you'd have multiple different solutions in place for different stakeholders in the process. What we're seeing now is the idea of creating a multi-stakeholder model where you create one central database or one central solution and then provide interfaces to the systems that are being used by the various stakeholders in the organizations that all work together to the benefit of people in a facility. So the idea here is that you create a single source of information that people can read from and contribute to in a secure way. Create solutions for contractors and vendors, for building operators, for tenants and employees, and for managers. And the idea is that you're all contributing pieces of information, and you're all retrieving the information that you need to streamline your interactions with all the rest of the stakeholders. And what we found is this has a lot of knock-on benefits as you go, and it helps to resolve a lot of the roadblocks that people run into when they're dealing with disconnected information systems. You know, one of them is that lack of connection means that you constantly have to wonder if the information you're looking at is accurate. So if you're dealing with 3 or 4 different copies of the same piece of information, you're relying on 3 or 4 different people or 3 or 4 different organizations to keep that information up to date, and it almost always drifts. So you wind up with one solution that's ahead of the others or might be more reliable than the others. So the overall information environment starts to drift away from reality, and you can't rely on it quite as much. Then there's also the issue of human error, or even worse, if you're relying upon outside contractors to provide you a periodic report on whether or not they're meeting an SLA, even with the best intentions, if someone's producing a report that could cost their organization tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, you're putting a tremendous amount of pressure on them to eliminate from the report as much of that, as many SLA fails as possible. If you're contributing to a live data model and you're able to review that information in real time and see how things are happening and generate reports along the way and manage by exception, you're giving the vendor and contractors every opportunity to resolve things before an SLA is blown, but you're also creating sort of a transparent governance model where it's very easy to see that the information has been built up in a responsible way. Again, one of the roadblocks to this is the sort of lack of transparency. When we first started working in this environment with multiple stakeholders, we thought there'd be a tremendous amount of resistance on the part of some FMs or contractors or vendors to this idea of implementing transparent systems, but the opposite has turned out to be true, in that transparency reduces response times, it improves information, it provides warning to site supervisors when they're in danger of blowing a deadline, and it really has improved service delivery, all the way through, the organization. And it's made a big difference in the quality of the information that you have and the reliability of the data and the way it contributes to decisions. And one of the other things that this helps to resolve is data delays. During the introductions, they mentioned the World Trade Center in New York. One of the great things about One World Trade is we've connected the elevator contractor to the owner to the major tenant, and then all of those solutions to the company that runs the observatory at the top of the building into one secure information environment. So there's really no delay at all from the time records are entered to when they can be seen by the stakeholders that they're relevant to. So it really improves the overall information environment tremendously. So in light of that idea about creating these sort of multi-stakeholder environments and then seeing how solutions can kind of govern the relationships between the stakeholders, we wanted to sort of talk about some of the advantages that provides. All of those that we talked about before can sort of be summed up in this view here. So the idea here is that you're looking at 2 vendors that are providing similar work to an owner or to a facility manager. On the left-hand side, vendor A is using a transparent system. You can see that of the things that they're supposed to be doing over the course of the month, there's a certain number of them that are closed out every week or every day. There's a certain number of them that may have additional notes entered, or they might move from a status of open to a status of pending because a part might need to be ordered, or they might not have access to a given space. And then along the way, you also have demand work orders that follow a particular profile. So they're responding to things as they need to get done. And over the course of the month, if you look at that graph, you have a sense that real work is being done, and you have a sense that it's good vendor behavior in that environment. If you look at vendor B, the demand work is very similar in that you have a record of the requests being made, and you may even be fortunate enough to see that the vendor is responding to those work orders and closing them out. But you have no transparency into the recurring activity that's governed by their contract. And then at the end of the month, right before your SLA reports are generated, thousands of work orders are being closed out at exactly the same date and time with no notes entered and no additional, nothing's moving from open to pending, no parts ever need to be ordered, or there's no delay because of lack of access to a room. It kind of indicates there might be a problem, you know, in your relationship with vendor B, or at least in your information system related to vendor B, where in vendor A you can have a lot more confidence about the information you have because you have that transparency into their process. So I just wanted to sort of mention sort of how these things lead together into creating an open, transparent environment, and how that helps streamline all the interactions between the various stakeholders in a facility's success. So what this provides is this gives you the ability to drill very quickly into which types of work are generating the most revenue, what's the most profitable work to be doing, or, you know, as a facility manager or as a vendor or a contractor or as a building owner, what work should be outsourced or not. And this is something that is an eternal question, really, that the pendulum kind of swings back and forth between outsourcing FM and insourcing it. So there's a cost and risk perspective to that. You can also benchmark your buildings much easier if you have transparency into all the work that's being done. And then what makes those buildings top performers? And what is the biggest impact on occupant satisfaction? You know, what's making people happiest, or what are the biggest headaches that people have? And what is putting buildings at risk of losing tenants or losing that satisfaction level? So all these things are available in that transparent environment. And sort of the underlying idea to all of this is, for all the stakeholders in a facility, if you're the facility owner or the facility manager, anyone who's doing work on your behalf, when they're doing the work, they're creating information, and that information ideally belongs to you. So you want to create information environments that capture that information in a streamlined way, and that actually provides the sort of advantages that we're talking about as we go through. So without further ado, I want to hand this over to Tommy, Tommy Gunn, who's going to take us through the 5 common blind spots in FM, and from a lessons learned standpoint, talk about how to deal with them.
Thank you, Jeff. First of all, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate today in the webinar. I did want to open with a slight disclaimer and let you know that I was scheduled to retire in July. My employment has been extended to September with Philips. And today my presentation is not a reflection of Philips or its portfolio or any other employer that I have had over the last 45 years, but it's a reflection of my experience and research over those 45 years in the real estate and facilities industry. So with that, so the first item that I put up here is called is blind spot number 1, and looking at cost alone rather than value. If you take a look at the slide, the chart here, this is a typical chart that you would see in your economics class in Economics 101, where it takes a look at price and quantity. And what I've done over the years is I've used this to show balance rather than just cost. What I like to suggest is that if you think about equilibrium, the optimal point for facilities management is where cost and quality are in balance or at equilibrium. It suggests that it's where our customers, whether they be internal or external, receive the greatest value. As FM has aged, we continue to look for ways to reduce cost rather than to focus on that balance. Many times the rework that we go through in implementing major cost reduction initiatives take out of consideration the equilibrium or where value is from our customers' standpoint. In the recent 5-year period, outsourcing has been looked at very critically simply because of the lack of value and trying to get back to where that balance is. Whether you're performed in-house, in a real estate organization, or you're an outsourced provider providing those services, again, we try to achieve the optimal equilibrium point where cost and value are in balance. The next slide talks about no proof of contractor certifications and trainings. Lessons learned, you can't afford not to know. We need visibility into all training, safety insurance certificates. You don't want to rely solely on what your providers, whether they be internal or external, say the current status is. You need to create preemptive system alerts when events are about to expire and come due. You want to have the ability to perform random audits to ensure all standard procedures are followed. And most importantly, you want to manage your portfolio proactively, not in arrears. Some lessons I have learned over the years, I've relied on, in the safety area, reports both from internal and external sources to suggest that my employees, whether they be contracted or in-house employees, had their safety training either required by OSHA or one of the employers that I had been employed by were completely up to date. And in a couple of cases, there were serious injuries that led to either permanent disability. And in going back and researching that information, what I found was that, in fact, the training had not been kept up to date. And it's a pretty simple process to proactively manage your portfolio and get those system alerts as to when training is due and how you would go about that. And it's really the ability to have proactive communication. Third, having a little visibility into your portfolio performance. I think that when you take a look at this slide here, it speaks for itself. We all know what an iceberg is. The iceberg shows us just the tip of what lies beneath. What you really need to do is have the ability to take a look at that full iceberg and understand all of the components that contribute to your portfolio. Too often, we rely on communication without the hard data to determine the status and condition. A couple of examples are within our PM program. In past assignments that I've had, I was responsible for implementing and managing a large client base, varied client base of preventative maintenance assignments. And what I found when taking some of them over was that in the past, the preventative maintenance reporting showed that there was 100% compliance with all of the PM tasks. But when we looked deeply, what we found were two components. First of all, there were a minimum number of pieces of equipment were actually put into the system. So if you had a portfolio of 1,000 pieces of equipment and only 140 of them were actually in the system, you would be showing 100% compliance. But unfortunately, the condition was that most of the portfolio was not even in the system, leaving you at risk, a significant risk. Next, as part of that, the lack of a collaborative relationship. We need to have employees, vendors, and contractors be able to see what work needs to be done. You need to have the ability for occupants to submit their work requests and give feedback on completed work. Certainly today, one of the things that we're finding is that the customer experience, particularly the feedback that we get from customers, whether that be from a service provider's perspective or internal real estate organization, has become a very critical component of the success of the real estate organization. 20 years ago, customer satisfaction was of little concern to real estate organizations, and today it has become one of the key metrics that we measure ourselves by and how we're perceived as providing that service. You need to have the ability to see the results and address exceptions based on any agreed upfront service level agreements. The information needs to have the ability to be provided with notifications and escalations automatically. You need your system to generate real-time customer satisfaction opportunities and feedback. Again, as I just stated a minute ago, customer satisfaction needs to be available, and it's a key metric of how we measure our success. but more importantly, you need that in a timely fashion. You want the customer to be able to give you that feedback after whatever service they've just received, rather than 30 days later when they may have had a bad experience with your real estate organization that morning and it becomes the reflective point for the entire month. You need the potential to build trust and collaborative working relationships with all involved. One system for tracking all vendors and their interface with your customers. Next, I kind of created this little slide with a little twist to it, in that we've all heard the adage that it's, you can't see the forest through the trees. I'd like to suggest that you can't see the tree in the forest, but you also have to continue to see the forest. What this basically I'm trying to represent here is that the old adage that you can't see the forest, you need to have the right number of metrics. Now, the right number of metrics is not 1, it's not 45, but it needs to be, what are the important trees in the forest? You need to be able to identify those and use those when you start to develop what are the key metrics that you want to see. You need to review what's important to the customer, internal or external, and target those metrics that can measure the performance in those areas that are important to your customer. You need to target themes that are normally, in my mind, when I set up a dashboard or portfolio, I normally look at service as one of my key areas that I would want to focus on and have a number of metrics. Certainly financial performance, although my experience suggests that we focus far too much attention on the financial performance and need greater balance, as I opened with. We certainly need to take a look at customer satisfaction and value that we add as a real estate organization or provider in the process of continuous improvement. Okay. Fifth, relying solely on historical reporting. On the left, you see the vision of what I believe is the way we need to be, and that's active monitoring. That needs to be real time. When I get into work in the morning, I like to have the ability to turn on my computer and see what the dashboard is and what those components are. If using predictive maintenance, you need to have the ability to actively take a look at that on a day-to-day basis and see if there are any issues that came up on a real-time basis. I believe in a narrow scope. What that suggests is that the metrics that matter most every day are 5 to 10, and those are the ones that you would have the ability to see each and every day. But most importantly, not just that those would be the only 5 to 10, each one of those metrics you have to have the ability to drill down into to get a better understanding. But you need to have you need to be able to see the forest on a first-hand basis, and the way you see the forest is through those particularly special trees that you identify. You need to be able to proactively address issues before they escalate. Today, in traditional reporting, it becomes historical. We're always looking at things that occurred usually 30 days prior, and those we spend far too much time going back and trying to reconstruct those areas of poor performance or areas that look like they need improvement, when if we had the ability to proactively manage that and see them right up front, you'd be able to use that for better decision making. So questions to ask when building your dashboard: what are you being measured on? Certainly, whether we're a service provider in a service provider organization or an internal organization to a corporation, there are key items that we are measured on. What are you trying to change or improve? What and how many metrics can you easily absorb and address? What has the biggest impact on your daily operations? Certainly, we all, I'm sure, have many examples of how if you had the metric readily available to you at 8 o'clock in the morning, you'd be able to address that item by 8:15. And in too many cases, we're dealing with it 72 hours later and spending half a day on it. And lastly, what are the major areas of risk within your organization? Okay. So how do you get started? The way I always approach it is I identify a stakeholder map. I try to identify who those key stakeholders are in my organization. And I basically lay this out for not just the metrics or the dashboard that I'm going to develop. I also use this to identify visitation, how often I should check in with my customer and my key stakeholders. I then use it and identify the operational areas you cannot easily assess today. Find out which information systems don't talk to each other and talk to each other well. Normally, my experience suggests that these are in the financial area. You know, usually most large corporations have extremely complex financial systems. They're not easily accessible in the form that we can extract that information and report out on that. So that's certainly one of the key things to identify way up front. And remember that the information that is a byproduct of any work done belongs to you.
Just one quick note before we go to questions. Like that point about information systems talking to one another, one of the things that has been interesting, given the complexity of the financial systems, what we've seen is that the pendulum seems to be swinging back towards sort of a best-in-class environment where people aren't looking for their financial systems to do everything for them anymore, and they're connecting a bunch of different programs. So they're curating a series of solutions to build an environment rather than trying to do everything through accounting. Because if you're trying to do everything through accounting, you're really restricted. And so it kind of fits into this whole idea of getting all the stakeholders to talk to each other and getting the various systems to talk to each other. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity in the operations side of the house to really tailor the environment to all the stakeholders, where once you're within the financial system, by nature, it's kind of walled off from a lot of those other stakeholders along the way. So what we'd like to do is open it up for questions, if there are any questions from the group.
Sure. So this is Bob again. We do have a couple of questions here. So people are asking, how do they decide which metrics they should be looking at versus what their managers or other stakeholders may want to see? How do you go about defining who should see what?
Well, I think there's a two-prong answer to that. First of all, as I indicated, there are certain areas that we're measured on as a manager. Certainly, those areas what you would want to include, but probably most importantly, when you get started, as I indicated, whether it be your manager should be part of that stakeholder map that you would identify, and I would assume that in a collaborative environment that you and your manager and your customers would identify what items are in fact key for you to identify. I can tell you that some years ago I had an experience where the company that I was employed by, we actually engaged at the time what was called the American Productivity Institute, because one of the key stakeholders that we had was a union, and their biggest complaint was that they were always measured on productive hours to complete certain tasks, and with no consideration of windshield time for those particular technicians that were mobilized. And in working with the American Productivity Institute, we actually developed a scorecard methodology where we could measure windshield time and essentially allow that to balance against those that were technicians that were in a large high-rise building and could more quickly access their work and complete a task. So I think the short answer is that you need to do it in a collaborative fashion with your manager and your key stakeholders.
And just also to connect this up too, when you're building those metrics and you're looking to measure things, one of the things Tommy mentioned earlier was in evaluating some sites and using their PM program, if all you looked at was whether or not there were any overdue preventive maintenance items, a site might get a 100% score on that there are no overdue items in every preventive maintenance work order that is supposed to be done according to the system is done, you know, they might look great if the metric is geared solely to that. But if you don't add a utilization factor to it, so you get some idea of, you know, how much that system is being used or how much of the relevant equipment is being captured, you know, that can be misleading. So if you only have 2 pieces of equipment out of thousands that are being tracked, it's relatively easy to get a perfect score in that environment, where if you're in a different facility, you might be very diligent about tracking all the equipment, and you're going to, by nature, have a lower score, but you're actually going to be doing a better job. So the metrics need to be tailored in that way.
And is there a key rule of thumb that people should keep in mind when they're trying to determine how often they should review those metrics and reassess what they're measuring?
Sure. Well, from my perspective, it's not how often. It should be part of your DNA, and it should be, as I kind of indicated, to me, when I turn on my computer in the morning, I want to have, I could almost make the analogy, it's like a patient monitoring system in a hospital. When I turn on the computer in the morning, I want to see what the health of my portfolio or facility is, and I want it to be real time. I want it to be interactive, so that if there was an event overnight or, you know, in the last 24 hours, I can see it in real time. So the question suggests that it's more the old way, my thinking of, you know, post-review of activity versus active and proactively involved in the portfolio.
Yeah, I think I definitely second that. And also, one of the ideas to sort of bear in mind, whenever you're looking at measurements and SLAs, wherever possible, you want to build in the idea of management by exception. So the idea that it's not how often you're necessarily looking at a report or even checking a dashboard, but if you have, if you've created a sort of environment where if something's overdue or in danger of becoming overdue, or one of your metrics is starting to slide out of the acceptable range, your solution should really start warning you, and it should start escalating that something's not quite right. So, and this actually gets back to that transparency idea, where if you have a request come in and you're on a 30-minute SLA, so you need to respond and be in front of the building occupant at their desk within 30 minutes. If 10 minutes goes by and nobody has acknowledged that they're responding, that can, in and of itself, generate a message. It can text a site supervisor for the vendor, or it can, you know, let a floor coordinator for the corporate client know that there's something that's in danger of becoming overdue. And then as you get closer and closer to it becoming overdue, that can escalate in the organization. So it gives everybody every chance to respond, you know, before the SLA is blown, and then that SLA being blown would show up on the dashboard. So you're sort of getting out in front of that by instituting sort of proactive monitoring, connecting all the stakeholders together, and doing notifications based on these exceptions. That's actually a that's actually a great idea to bear in mind as you're sort of putting these measurements together. And then also, just I noted when the question came up, two of the other things that I think contribute to identifying what to measure. You know, certainly if you've been bitten by something in the past, Tommy had mentioned, you know, whether it's an injury and it turns out that the stakeholder or the person doing the work didn't have the training that the system actually said they had. The more you can do to push discipline through your systems and solutions out to those stakeholders so that they're checking off that things are being done properly and you have some transparency into it, you can build up metrics that sort of identify those risks. And then another rule of thumb that I think is always useful is, you know, what are the decisions you have to make? You know, there are hundreds of decisions that need to be made. And a lot of times when you're trying to make a decision, you consistently sort of search for the type of information to support them. The more you can design metrics around that, the better off you're going to be, I think.
Great answer. So the next question we had is you know, we talk about real-time monitoring, and what tools should people consider using for real-time monitoring? I mean, is it just straight BMS? Is it custom tools from the vendors themselves? Should you go to the market to look for things? I mean, and then how do you determine that, you know, what analytics you should be deriving from those tools?
So I'll start, I guess. First of all, it would go back to what are the important components of your measurement. What are you trying to measure and why? Then you today, I mean, most of the solutions are so customizable and tailored to specific either product lines or people that we work with. You most cases have to collect a collection of them. So as an example, a portfolio that I managed a few years ago, I had a whole number of regular metrics that I would look at. They'd be financial, they'd be what the status of my work orders were. But in the process, we started to get heavily involved in managing electricity and the green carbon footprinting. We engaged with a specialty company that provided us with the real-time ability to take a look at key sites, what their usage was, demand usage was, what the contribution for the reduction, and how you could equate that to your footprint reduction for carbon footprinting. So I don't think there's one solution. I think again it's dependent on what's important in your portfolio. One of the slides that I showed took a look at. You have to first identify what's important to you and what are you being measured on, and then figure out from either the market or different providers what tools are available to give you real-time ability to manage those portfolio.
It's interesting too because you can look at real-time monitoring in sort of two ways, and the question kind of highlights that a little bit. If you talk to somebody who's on the engineering side of the house and you talk about real-time monitoring, even the question goes right to BMS as being, the building itself is generating data constantly, and through BMS systems and now through sort of the Internet of Things idea where a lot of the assets and devices in the building are throwing off data almost constantly. There's an opportunity for real-time monitoring there, which is sort of more of a technical real-time monitoring where it's the pieces of equipment and systems that are providing data or making it available. And the sorts of things that you can bring in, you can do the simplest way to do real-time monitoring is if the BMS system fires off an alarm, and you can bring that alarm into your workflow so that it creates notifications and creates, sort of the work order to mitigate what's been detected in BMS. That's sort of at a very surface level. But you can get all the way into looking at the behavior of various pieces of equipment and then looking at the sort of human factor in real-time monitoring, which is, let's say that you make a change to your BMS system to try and save energy, because this is something that we hear about all the time. People are shaping the power curve in the building to try and save, even if you can shave a couple of percentages off of your energy usage, that can be a big deal from a cost standpoint. Well, as Tommy mentioned before, where you had that equilibrium graph, if you drive the decision-making off of a metric that just looks at your cost, you might be missing out on a huge spike in comfort complaints that are coming from the spaces that you're shaving that, HVAC, energy off of. So you've got real-time monitoring in the sense of looking at the BMS system and looking at the temperatures of the spaces and looking at energy usage and to try and sort of, shape things there. But there's another dimension to the real-time aspect of it where if you make a change and then all of a sudden you notice a spike in the number of hot and cold calls and the number of complaints coming through surveys, if the survey responses you're getting from the building occupants all of a sudden drop from a 4 to a 3 on a scale of 1 to 5, those are all, substantial things that contribute to perceived value or perceived performance for the real estate organization, that also have a real-time aspect to them. If you can respond to those fast, you can get out in front of some of those complaints so they don't fester. And I think that can be a really big deal from a real-time monitoring standpoint. So to answer the question specifically, yes, BMS systems and sort of the IoT idea is huge, but also connecting it to your internal systems that deal with occupant satisfaction, and then also number of repair calls versus maintenance calls is also another very good one. And from a vendor standpoint, and as we talked about at the beginning, the more you can do to get your vendors and subcontractors to either use your information solution and contribute to your data model, or connect their information system to yours so that it's providing the information in real time. All those are huge opportunities for real-time monitoring. And a great example is actually elevator entrapment, or elevator entrapment in a high-rise office or in a stadium environment where you have an incident, like a fight or a slip and fall or an ejection, that sort of thing. You know, if you go back even a couple of years, you used to wind up with 3 or 4 different records that actually represented different perspectives on the same incident, the same elevator entrapment, or the same, fight in a stadium. Where now, if you connect all those systems together in real time, the record gets created as close as possible to when the issue is recognized, and then all of the other stakeholders are contributing information to that record. And it just gives you such a better insight into what's really going on, and it allows you to have a lot more confidence in the metrics that you do show on a dashboard, because you can drill down into them and look all the way back up the chain to when the information was originally captured.
Good, great answer. And it kind of leads me to the next question, and it's specifically around vendors. And how do you engage your vendors and get them to kind of get on board with this new mindset? Because it's a fundamental shift in the way that they do business. I mean, traditionally they provided services, they gave you a hard copy report, or they gave you access to a site that, and we saw a representation of that earlier by Tommy on people that fill out their performance reviews, for lack of a better term, at the end of a month. How do you typically have the conversation with them and get them engaged and get them to not resist the way in which they're delivering the services? Is there any insight into that?
Yeah, I think, well, from my perspective, it's a very difficult process to go through. But I would tell you that today, I mean, it's just a different world today than it was certainly for me when I started getting into the real estate and facility services in 1968, which probably most of the people on the phone weren't even born then. But essentially, it really comes down to trust and collaboration. In this world today, we have to learn to work together a lot closer, whether we're a vendor or a provider within a company, etc. I have seen a very successful assignment that I was on a number of years ago with 2 outsourced providers to a very major investment firm that had to work collaboratively, and this was very new to both of these providers. And then they had to get all of their respective service providers to work in collaboration with both. We did have real-time monitoring. It was in its infancy then. But through the building of trust and collaboration, it wound up being probably one of my most memorable and successful assignments that I've had in my career. So, I mean, it starts again with building the trust and through collaboration.
Yeah, we've seen that too, and we've actually seen kind of a whole continuum between, in some environments, when you come in and part of your idea is to bring transparency to, all these different stakeholder relationships. When you start to talk about bringing transparency to something, the way the other stakeholders react to that transparency can tell you a lot about the work they're doing or sort of what's actually going on behind the scenes. And we've seen environments where, vendors that might initially be reluctant to open up their systems or to use the owner or FM's system and contribute to the same data model. In some of those cases, once someone sees that it's improving response times and it's helping them actually meet their SLAs, if it's done the right way and it's introduced the right way, you're almost bringing it into the environment and saying, well, this is a tool that's going to actually help you meet the SLA rather than just beat you up after the fact. And in a lot of cases, you can win people over with that. It actually does streamline things. It gives them better information and it helps them along the way. That might be a tough sell day one, but in some cases, again, if you've built up the right relationship with them, it's a fairly easy process to go through. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we've had a number of owners, and actually more and more often, facility owners, when they're writing up their bids for either an FM or for vendors if they're doing self-management, more and more people are writing into their contracts that the contractor needs to use the information system designated by the owner or by the facility manager, because there's just so much to be gained through that transparency that it's really not, in some cases, it's really not being left, up to someone to win someone over. It's becoming kind of a condition of getting the job, because that transparency is such a big issue from a risk management standpoint. You can argue back and forth about, some vendors might not want the transparency from a day-to-day efficiency standpoint, although I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I think it's an argument you can win pretty easily. From a risk management standpoint, it's no contest, because even the example earlier where there's an injury, if you don't have a solution where you can actually see that the person who was injured checked off that they took the training that they were indicated to have had and didn't really have, that can potentially shift a tremendous amount of risk and liability up and down that chain. The more you can do to capture the information out on the spokes rather than at the hub, and have that information flow in a way that you can have confidence in, it's essential. So I think that there's actually a very strong argument to write this into the relationships that you have with those other stakeholders and say, this data model is actually going to be ubiquitous in this environment. You can use your system and contribute to it, or you can use the systems that'll be provided by the owner or the facility manager. But underlying it all, that data model needs to be very broad and very deep, just because its value is so obvious, just from a risk standpoint and from a performance standpoint.
And you used two words during your response that I think resonated solidly with me, and that was risk and control. So when we talk about that, and you talk about vendors getting access to your systems remotely and being able to get in and perform maintenance and hopefully increase the level of support that they're providing and ultimately increase the value of the asset by making it a more desirable place to be. When you give your vendors access to that, how do you control what they can and can't see and what they can and can't get into? I mean, we all hear about IoT and people getting access to things that maybe they shouldn't have, or it opens up a security risk. Is that something that you'd also put into your agreements with them, or is that something you work with your IT folks on, or how does that work?
Well, I mean, certainly there's a technical aspect of it where you're implementing controls, on the system level in terms of controlling access to it. But for a lot of the vendors and subcontractors and facility management firms, the access that you're providing them is very limited, in that if you're utilizing a solution for contract governance, you abstract your contract into a system, and then you have that abstract produce the work that needs to be done on a schedule. So the vendor can see online a list of everything that needs to get done, and they can see any sort of corrective items that have come up along the way. The vendor can see what they need to do within their area of responsibility. They can update notes, they can put in the materials they used, the time they've spent, all that sort of stuff. But they're not allowed to actually close things. So the idea is that they can move something from open to completed, so they can identify that they've done the work. They can identify that they've put in all the required information that the solution's been set up to require them to put in. But then there's like a closure process that, in our experience, it's been good to have the closure process rest with either the facility manager or the owner. So you actually do a quick review of everything that's been done, either through a dashboard or by, if there's a relatively short list of items, you can review them in detail. And then you can do a close. And then that closing gives you access to more information from the financial side, and it provides that information to other stakeholders sort of back of house. So what you're exposing to the subcontractors and vendors is pretty minimal. The other thing that this does, and it's a huge point from an ownership standpoint, give or take on the facility manager side, but by doing this the right way, you actually prevent lock-in, where you wind up in a situation where you're sort of stuck with a given vendor or a given manager because they hold all the information about your facility. So the idea is that you create a transparent environment. The data is actually owned by the owner of the facility or the manager of the facility, You then have the ability to benchmark vendors against one another very easily, and you can benchmark managers and benchmark buildings. And it allows you to work with facility management and with vendors in such a way that it lowers the hurdle to switching if you're not getting the performance that you want. So that becomes a very valuable aspect of capturing this information and bringing it in, and it's even more incentive to write it into the contracts that you have with all the stakeholders.
Excellent. Well, this has been some great information. I appreciate you guys taking the time today. We're out of questions, so I'd like to thank Jeff Thompson and Tommy Gunn for their time today. I'd also like to thank Aware Manager for sponsoring today's webinar. For those that are on the call, a copy of today's presentation materials and the speaker contact info is going to be sent to all the participants. You should anticipate receiving that probably by Monday. And a recording of today's webinar is also going to be available to all the participants, and that should be up on the website probably on Monday as well. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for your participation and conclude today's presentation. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.